funny. Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Scott, and you are with the Baltimore Racial Justice Action's August 13th of the month event titled Expanding the Black Imagination, Race, Comics, and Resistance. First, I'm going to give the mic to Michelle, who's going to give us a little bit of info about BRJA and why we do these events, and then we're going to get started with the conversation. Michelle?
Thank you, Julia. Good evening, everyone. We're really excited about our topic tonight. We've been having some really fun conversations in preparation for this event, so we're glad that you all could join us. And we know that, with everything going on in the world, there's other things you could be doing, so we're always happy and excited when you all join us for our 13th of the month events. So the event for tonight is Expanding the Black Imagination, Race, Comics, and Resistance. And we have a panel that has been really fun to listen to. They know their stuff, and you guys are definitely going to be enjoying this tonight. Real quick, before we get started tonight, though, just want to remind everyone that we do have events every 13th of the month. The topics vary, but they're always centered around issues around race in America. Also want to let you all know that we do have a YouTube channel now. It's fairly new. So events like this will be on the YouTube channel as well as other content. So tonight is being recorded, just to remind everyone of that. Also want to remind you all that we do take donations. We have a PayPal link that will be in the comments. It will be in the chat for you all to use if you would like to donate to BRJA and the work that we do. And I think that's it. We can go ahead and get started. Back to you, Julia.
Cool. Thank you. So before we get started, I am going to actually go to Rajani. As if you did not know, we had one of our BRJA family members passed away recently, Avis, and she was a huge, just like Blerd. And so I want to give the mic over to Rajani to kind of lead us in this moment of silence.
Can you hear me?
Yep. I can hear you.
Okay.
Echo.
Echo, 1 second. Hello. Is that better? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you all for patience with my tech. So yes, hi, I'm Rajani. I am also with BRJA. As Julia mentioned, one of BRJA's founding members, mentor to many of us, general badass, OG Blerd, Avis Ransom, trained chemist, trained chemical engineer, trained everything. She was brilliant. And about almost exactly a month ago, she unfortunately passed away due to a battle with cancer, a couple years battle with cancer, and she fought real hard. And she is with us, and this, I think this event definitely is in honor of her and all that she opened up for us. So let's just take a moment of silence right now and thinking about Avis and our ancestors, and if you didn't get a chance to meet her, think about the joy that BRJ brings to your life. So just a moment. Thank you for that, folks. And continuing in her honor, we thought, she really trained us all, most of us at BRJA, in really creating some interactive workshop activities. And so I wanted to encourage everyone here to engage in one activity to kind of broaden our imaginations. And so if we just take a moment, there's some directions on here, but I'll kind of read them out. So it's a meditation and a drawing exercise. And so we're going to get creative. So if you have any drawing materials at your disposal, paper, pens, markers, crayons, whatever you may have handy, you want to play around with tonight, or at least get yourself started in some doodling, and then get out the whole arts and crafts kit later to expand on. Just get something. And I want everyone to kind of take a moment and reflect on your favorite imaginary, fantastical, or sci-fi world. I know many of us might have favorites. Whatever one's coming to your mind right now as like, yes, that would be dope. Namely one that you'd like to live in, right? So I'm not talking some Mad Max, you know, apocalyptic thing unless you're really into the Fury Road. Maybe you're down with that. But if you'd really like to live in this space, imaginary, sci-fi, fantastical world, put yourself in that place. And just kind of think about that for a moment. And now I encourage folks, really just for, let's say, 3 minutes or so. I'm looking to Julia to make sure that's okay. 3 minutes, okay, to just draw. So draw some pictures, doodle, reflect on this magical, pleasurable place. And we have some questions here for you to think about. So as you're kind of doodling, and I'll be quiet for a moment so you can doodle in silence, but I'll read out these questions. So what do the people or creatures look like in this world? Are there humans? If there are humans, what do they look like? Is there any injustice in this imaginary, fantastical world? Any form of injustice at all? Is it a racially equitable place? And I'll add to that, does race exist? Is there a sense of liberation in this world? Can you think of characters or peoples or communities that have a strong sense of liberation? What does that look like? And how does it feel to take part in this world if you are putting yourself in there? So those questions are on here, and we're going to just put 3 minutes on a clock in my head and take some time to doodle and draw. Just 1 more minute. So while I would love to do some show and tell, we are not going to do that right now. Maybe send some pictures. You could put them on the BRJA Facebook page. And
Sure.
hold on to this drawing through your weekend, through your week, through the rest of the year, hell, right? And keep adding to it. Keep adding to the imagination. Something that Avis often encouraged of me as a fellow nerd with her was to kind of just push our creativity and our imaginations beyond our ability, right? To imagine as far as we possibly can into the future and then be very creative from that place, that kind of thing. Be creative beyond you can even imagine and keep pushing yourself and then create that with each other and shape that world. So thank you, Avis, for that. Thank you for being present with us. And thank you, everyone, for doing this exercise. Much love. Passing it off to, I think, Julia.
Yep. So thank you guys so much. Thank you, Rajani, for that. So let's kind of like start about why we're even here. So normally, as I'm sure some people know, comic book movies have become really, really big. And normally, it's August, we would have been probably like spending money to go to the next comic book movie to see what was going on. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we were not going to be in movie theaters for the time being, even though I miss it. And so we thought this would be a really good time to discuss Black people, brown people in comic book and comic book culture. And so to kind of culture. So before we get started a bit, I am going to go over our panel. My name is Julia. We have Rajani here, who is also going to be helping out. We have Dr. Khalima Young, who is going to be adding some of her wonderful expertise, and Professor Stephen Leyva from University of Baltimore. Just kind of get us grounded, let's talk about what a blerd is. I'm sure some people may have heard of the word, some people may have not, but let's talk about what blerd is, and that's kind of grounding us in this conversation of expanding our imaginations as Black comic book fans. Who wants to go first? Khalima? Dr. Young.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So at its base, a blerd is simply a Black nerd. How this word came to be and why it carries so much cultural weight is really interesting. The first time it was ever actually used was in an episode of Scrubs, and the Black doctor, Dr. Turk, he was talking to the main character, the goofy white guy that I can't remember his name, and he asked, "What were you doing this weekend?" The white actor asked the Black actor, and he said, "I was hanging out with my cousin who's a blerd." And the white guy was like, "What?" "He's a Black nerd. So we were hanging out for a very long time." And that phrase, for some reason, has become just a regular part of our cultural imaginary since. From this one moment on a television show. So that's where it comes from as a phrase. What it really means can be unbelievably problematized. Why can't a nerd just be a nerd? Is there something actually specific about being Black and being a nerd? What the hell's a nerd in the first place? And when I think about the way nerd has been used in my life and how it's been used at me, on me, right? And how the ways I've adopted it, I think of it as someone who is very, very enthusiastic about certain things that might not have mainstream appeal. So you can be a nerd about a number of things. You can be a nerd about cars, which I am. You could be a nerd about Superman, which I am. You could be a nerd about Star Trek, which I am. So you can be a nerd about a whole lot of things. The problematization comes in the adding a particular identity marker to it. Professor Leyva, you even started this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I just to add on to what Dr. Young was saying, I think that that term, that portmanteau, exists within a tradition in Black idiom of synthesis, right? So, you know, we say, you know, for people who have mixed ethnic identities, we might say they're, you know, Black and Asian, they're Blasian, or they're Blexicans. I mean, there's a, you know, even Rodriguez has a kind of essay about that, about reimagined Americans, where, you know, Blexicans is in the title. So I see it within a tradition of African-American idiom of synthesizing language to make something new. But I also like sort of have to acknowledge how that term also represents a combination of two identities for which that could historically have invited harm onto the body, right? So nerds weren't always like hipster cool, like, you know, a term to which you would grab hold of with safety, right? And by which to find community. It was something, like Dr. Young said, that was thrust upon you as a pejorative, right? And think about those two, like Blackness and the way that it's imagined and has been imagined historically. I mean, what do we say all the time, right? Everybody wants Black cool until it's time for Black suffering, right? And I think people who either self-identify as nerds or like are drawn to that culture, I think they feel that same sort of kind of tension, right? And so the combination of the two feels kind of like almost inevitable. But I also am interested in how it's problematized and why there obviously is a rhetorical and historical reason why there needs to be the term itself. And I would say ultimately it comes from folks saying doing something, liking this particular thing is not Black. You know, they're like basically saying like, why are you listening to that kind of music? Why are you watching those Japanese cartoons? Why are you doing that? That's what white people do. You know, so whether that came from other white people or from other Black people, it's out. I think it's out of those tensions that, you know, that language arises. And, you know, because I'm a poet, I'm always thinking, you know, language is the first battleground, right? So we gotta, you know, I think the term has its kind of staying power because it arises out of that kind of those tensions.
I think also the more that it has become a mainstream phrase, the more people who might have shied away or felt embarrassed about being into anime or being into comic books or science fiction or just being into, I don't know, Mumford and Sons, whatever the heck you want to be into, that that was a dear white people reference. Anyway, that it's a way to say it's almost a reclamation of that as a part of the identity. And I think also a big part of it, and the reason why it carries so much cultural water outside of that, is that the folks that used to get pushed into the lockers and treated like poo are now the cultural workers who are working in industries that are able to push it out for mass consumption. So it just kind of makes sense that it would take on a little bit more water as well at this moment.
Yeah. Dr. Yin, do you think it has a combination, a kind of intersection with capitalism too, and that once nerds started like owning the world, right? Once like, you know, CEOs and nerds started being these really massively wealthy folks, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I want to be that. You know, I'll be the Black Bill Gates in a minute. You know.
I think it's definitely that, because of course race and capitalism, they're co-constitutive. So if you're going to do anything that's racialized, you're going to have a capitalist part. Right, there's going to be an arm of it that is about sold, mass marketed, and given back to the masses in some way, shape, or form. I think that's a part of it. I think also the fact that there are so many different mediums with which this kind of material can come out now, right? From fan fictions, from blogs. It's not just like a comic book and then occasionally a show on television. So more people are able to see it and make it and talk about it and hype it up, so that folks who have money and want to make more money recognize all of these subcultures that they can exploit for mass marketing and for capitalism. So I think that's a part of it too.
Yeah. I think there's.
I was gonna say,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, those are all like important points. I know, like for me, being a blerd about a bunch of things, and we talked about this before, that a lot of the time the comic book landscape has been like pretty white. It's like, so before it's been like very like white male oriented and dominated. Like a lot of the kind of like 80s movies has kind of been about like white men and nerdom. And so I think that the word blerd also kind of creates this other co-community where it's like seeking safety amongst that kind of like dominant white experience that, you know, like can be pretty harmful. So, you know, it's about like finding stories and finding ourselves in stories that we don't normally, you know, we're not normally sold to. It's not sold to us, but it's like finding ourselves in these places and enjoying it and finding love and expression in it.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it is a sort of anti-othering term. Right? It is a thing that that for those of us who grew up in the sort of colorblind 1990s, you know, coming into through our adolescence, where I don't see race was a common phrase told to us, you know, which is ridiculous on its face. But it asserts, right, like, hey, I'm not going to subsume my blackness to this other taxonomy, right, to this other sort of term that is meant to be sort of universal, which always gets refracted into whiteness, right? So that, I mean, I do think it has that resistance sort of mode to it, but it also, I mean, I think about just personally the times when I was in minority, times where Black folks were the minority in a space, whether it was school or like church or a club or something like that. That's when I got the most like stuff directed at me about authenticity around Blackness. Yes. Right? Because there was so few, everything was reduced, right? When I was in an all Black high school, no one ever questioned my Blackness ever because there was so much variation, right? And so I think about that too. It's like, oh, that term blerd is in some ways trying to tell someone, like you were saying, Julia, you're not alone, right? That you are not the only, you're not an oddball, you know, there are others like you, which, you know, can be both comforting and sort of illuminating as well.
Right. I agree with both of those things. I also want to say about the safety and number situation. I can say from my own personal experience that when I go to a con or I go to something and there's a panel that is specific, or there's a group chat or food meetup time of the blerds, like I want to be there. So I'm like, yay, I can be there, and all of my awkwardness without feeling like I'm going to be judged on my awkwardness. But still, always you have it. We're social creatures, and we really love an in-group and an out-group. So even within our subcultures, there's still these in-group and out-group conversations about authenticity of identity that are often shaped around masculinity, often shaped around patriarchal nonsense, and often shaped around capitalism and whiteness. So all of you can find a community and make it all work, and it's still going to roll back down to the hegemon. So,
all right. So, like, let's talk about how that actually does evolve, like, in the comic book sphere now. So, like, what we're seeing is we have all sorts of people in various groups who are really into comic books, into sci-fi, into storytelling, and how has that like evolved on our screens and our page? Do we see more of ourselves there? Like, are there more Black comic book writers, comic book stores? Like, how is that actually having an impact? Like, I know we discussed the importance of Black Panther, which came out like 2-3 years ago at this point, and how big that was. It was a massive moment, and we would hope it would have an impact on people reading more comics or writing more comics or kind of telling their own stories. But like, how does that actually impact it? So how has this actually evolved?
Professor Leyva, you investigate comic book stores?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's to the question about Black-owned comic book stores. There's definitely a dearth of them. So just like you know, for a reference point, we live for those of us who live in Maryland, we live in a particular place in which there are an abundance of comic book stores. It's an absurdity of riches. So you can drive within within 30 miles and hit somewhere between 10 to 15 different stores. None of them are Black owned in Maryland. And now my some of my research on that is pretty nascent, but I know of a Black owned store that's run by a Black woman in Philadelphia, and then a Black owned store in Chicago, and that's about it. Now I'm not saying that that's definitively it. Those are just the ones I know about, and I frequent them pretty often whenever I travel. So it's there's a if you think of comic book stores as like one of the places in which as the direct market, they are having direct contact with those who are consuming intellectual property. It matters, right? What gets put on the shelves, who is making decisions about what's in front. Does it have a kind of Black section just because of the protests for George Floyd, or have they always had, a Black section, or is that section, sort of integrated right into the things that they've chosen to buy for their shelves and who they imagine their consumer base to be. So there's definitely, but when I was a child, the thought of a Black owned comic book store was like a unicorn. Like that, I was like, nah. Like that's not what we do. I mean, even there, I was like, I could be a Black nerd and recognize myself as that, but we don't own stores. It's not something that sort of thing was in my 5-year-old, 6-year-old brain.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think there has been an evolution over the last several years, and increased representation and ongoing conversations about who's in the writing room, who's the inker, who's the drawer, who's the person imagining things. But all of this still has to do with capitalism and what's going to sell the most on the shelves, right? Like the first ever Black superhero was named in a comic was Lion Man. Right? He came out of like, I don't know, 1950 or whatever.
No, 30s. It's earlier than that. Yeah.
Okay, so it was like Lion Man, right? And then we had to wait 20 years. One episode of Lion Man, which was released from this one Black comic book press, and then we had to wait until Black Panther, like 20 years later. So it's there's definitely been more folks in the writing room creating more content within the last decade or so, but it's been a slow and steady process. And the majority of Black or POC comic book characters that hold water that we understand were created by white men. Right? So that influences how they've been able to sort of navigate, those characters have, how much they've tread sort of water in our cultural imagination in terms of authenticity or coming up as a reactionary character because you need it at this particular moment, or you're trying to cleave onto a specific cultural moment. So we create a new character of some way, shape, or form. So
it's really important. I mean, because I think when we're looking at the history of that of representation, there's both the sort of long periods, the lacuna of the absence of representation, but I mean, as Dr. Young was mentioning, it's always important for us to remember that the tradition is there, right? So like Negro Comics, Lion Man, that's happening in the 30s, but also Jackie Orms is doing her cartooning in the 30s, being the first like Black syndicated strip. And she's writing this character, Torchy Brown, in a strip called Dixie to Harlem. That's taking on a lot of things like bus boycotts. It's but it's slice of life, right? So we're talking about, this is essentially Jackie Orms writing about what she's seeing in a very mimetic way. And what you see missing, and I was kind of in some of the an online forum thinking, asking this question as a research question, what's really missing in that whole journey is Black women writing Black female identified superheroes, right? So I asked, I was like, who's the first Black woman to write a Black femme-identified superhero. And I kid you not, right? It might be like 2007, right? Or 2015, wow, depending on what you count as a superhero. So like there's a comic called Genius. Afuya Richardson is the artist on it. So it's kind of a combo, right? Or maybe you look at Moon Girl, and that the artist on that is an Afro-Latina who lived in Spain. But it's wild, right? How like, and this is something that Dr. Young was just saying, is that often we're getting representation, but it's through the lens of creators who are not representative of Black folks. And what do we do with that, right? Like, how do we navigate that? A show that I really like that's on Netflix right now is Kipo, and the Age of Wonder Beast. I think this show is fantastic in terms of just representation of Black folks in animation, and the main character is someone of Black and Korean descent, but also a kind of mutant as well. So there's this like third like thing, which is why she's purple right in the front there. But again, this comes from a webcomic and the creators of White Man, so it's a wonderful show, right? And I think it mostly achieves that kind of escapism and that fun. I mean, it's very influenced, I think, by Avatar: The Last Airbender and shows like that. And it also employs a lot of Black voice actors, which I love, right? Oh, yeah. But it mostly avoids talking about race, except for talking about mutants and humans. It mostly just like assuages all of that. Yeah. But it's it's still a wonderful show.
Yeah, so that's like really similar to what we see in X-Men, where like we have mutants that are Black. As you all know, I'm very, very familiar with Storm. But that, like, for example, we have like X-Men, representing different Black people in history. So you have Professor X, which, a lot of the time has been used, or he has been used as a example of Martin Luther King. And then you have Magneto, who is supposed to be like the Malcolm X of the mutants. And, they kind of talk about how these characters are used to explain like racial issues without actually talking about race. So it's like, we're talking about mutants. It's like, so what exactly are we talking about? And how does that actually impact I think the demographics that actually consume the art? Like, that's a really important question too.
I always think that the mutants as Black people conversation, or as like mutants as a discussion about racism, gets very, very blurry. Because what happens when you have the characters just like, I don't want to be a mutant? What conversation are we having then? What conversation are we having when Wanda Maximoff can be like, no more mutants, and everybody's freaking gone, right? Right? And then suddenly we don't have any of the quote unquote racist people in the world anymore.
Right.
That metaphor gets extremely muddy and complicated, and it isn't and using it isn't, when comic book writers use it as the platform to discuss race and racism and difference, it can muddy the actual structural conversation that has to happen. I don't know how we would in real life suddenly blink and there'd be no more Black people. Like, how that
would suck. For sure. Yeah, or even just. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, Professor Leyva, unless you know how we can blink. And
well, but why would I want to know? But I was just going to add, like, even like recently in comics, the idea of a retcon, right? That they go back and change who is even a mutant. I mean, you mentioned Scarlet Witch. They basically said, well, she's not a mutant anymore. And so that idea that you could sort of be or not be or choose to be does get really muddy. It makes the allegory or the metaphor really strained.
Yeah.
I mean, and in that way, I mean, it's difficult. So you're talking about like an ideology, right? Something that's been abstracted maybe from what's in the culture into something that can be more easily consumed by a broader culture. But like it's like it sometimes makes us not ask the right questions
Right.
about the things. So like, I mean, Storm, right? Who does not love the goddess, right? Like, who does not love her? And the way, and even if I, thinking about what Storm's impact has been on Black queer folks, right, in terms of representation, is like really, really important. But also, right, like I have to ask the question: the first time, right, we get a mainstream Marvel character in comic books history, she does not have what we would traditionally think of as hair that looks Black, right? Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying there aren't Black people who have that texture of hair. Obviously, we know that, right? But she's got blue eyes sometimes. She's got, a different kind of hair. And so, should I then read that as a kind of slide towards a kind of almost like magical mulatto, what's actually happening there? But all of her contextual, like fictional history is she's African, right? Like she spends time in Cairo, she spends time in other parts of North Africa, she spends time in Wakanda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a strange, I mean, I think not strange, I shouldn't say, but I think it goes back to the fact that even when we get representation, it's filtered through a white imagination, right? And that we don't, it's almost 10 to 15 years before we get somebody like Misty Knight, right? And then, or you get somebody like Luke Cage, and then again you're in that recursive cycle of, do I feel happy about this representation, or do I feel troubled because of its connection to Blaxploitation? Like how do I manage and wrestle? I mean, we're in that double consciousness business all the time, and sometimes it's exhausting, right? And I mean, when I'm like, comics are supposed to be fun, I just want to see my people in comics and have some fun and not be troubled. But
I don't know. I go back on the Storm thing though. Can we go back on the Storm thing real fast? Just on the Storm. Here's the thing. As a young person, as a young girl who was in the comics and in the superheroes and all that stuff, like Storm was all the things. How about the fact that she had a mohawk and could ride a motorcycle was the best damn thing I could ever see in my life. I didn't care. I thought it was great that her hair was able to be like a mohawk and white and big, and that she was able to change her eyes when she used her powers, right? Because as a young Black girl growing up, like I literally took the few white Barbies I had, I cut her hair off, painted her Black with a Sharpie, and put little spokes in my like Barbie bicycle thing so I could make Storm so she could fight the Transformers, right? Like the idea for me as a young Black girl in the 80s watching Storm as she developed from I act like I don't understand what the modern world is to the sophisticated woman that she is, also afforded me this opportunity to think of my Black female existence as being changeable, as something. I could pull my hair off if I wanted and dyed it white. I could, ride this motorcycle looking like a leather chick, like the Mary Jane girls. It's all good. It was so I think that even if it was filtered through a white male gaze and a little bit of a colonial context too, right? Colonial narrative context, it still offered. And I think that's what all marginalized folks do. Like we find our opportunity in the most screwed up room that we're in, right? We find to shimmy and make it work. And that's all I want to say about Storm. Y'all can.
Yeah, so I totally agree. I was going to bring up the fact that a lot of the time you kind of mentioned that a lot of the stories that we're seeing are either written by like white people or white men, and so therefore now it's kind of filtered through even when we see ourselves. So we see that a lot, I think, in, for example, obviously Black Panther, where the characters are created by white people, but the film itself, it was a huge push to make sure that it was like Black people behind the scenes writing that story so that it became across as authentic to the viewers. And it told, I think, a very personal, like, Black story. Like, it was very much about, like, Black Americans and Africans and some of the resentment between us and some of the anger there. And so there's that kind of thing. I think even with Watchmen, we saw recently where it heavily dealt with race, where it was like very much naming it. And granted, Watchmen originally dealt with a lot of political issues, but I think that the way that the Watchmen series on HBO really dealt with race was really, really pivotal to why it was so good. And then I mean, there's a lot of other, I think, like Luke Cage, very similar. Like when Luke Cage came out, I remember like it crashing Netflix, and there were so many like connections to like Black culture that like if you didn't know about that, like you had to look that up. Like I actually saw like white people online, like I don't know what this means. And so I mean that's like for us a lot of the time growing up, for me at least, that was kind of part of the course. Like I didn't know what a lot of that stuff meant. I had to look it up. But for a show where I was like, oh, I know that's what they're talking about. Or they're talking about Black sororities. I don't know about that. Like I get that joke because it was written for me. It was a Black person behind the scenes, clearly making sure that that I felt included and that I was a part of that story.
Yeah, I think what you all are both bringing up and what Dr. Young was bringing up about the way in which these characters allow for that expansiveness of Blackness, of what Blackness can be, and how you can see yourself, containing multitudes, to use that Whitman line, like how you can be many things. That you don't have to be reduced, I think is really, really important. And even just thinking about Luke Cage, the fact that not all Black people have to feel the same way about the show. Some people can like it, some people can drag it, and that's what that is allowed, right? Because we don't have to sort of defend it, right? Because it doesn't have to be like, oh, don't come for Luke Cage because that's all we got, as we have more things, you get to be more full people, and I think that's really a really important thing. I think that's a thing that I often sort of experienced as well, thinking about like, well, who are the Black nerds that we get to see in the early 90s? Is Urkel my only option? My name is Steven too. Do I live with that representation? Or can I be, like a Jon Stewart? Can I be somebody who, can I be a Static Shock? Can I be any of those people that those options of what my Blackness can be and how it can be broad? And I think is the whole ball game, right?
Yeah. That's where the Black imagination that's
exactly
the talk, right? How can we expand, right? And what comic and science fiction actually do for our ability to expand, right? Hi, Static Shock.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I remember when we were kind of getting ready for this event, I was talking to Dr. Young, and we were talking about how like lucky a lot of the kids are now that there is like something to choose from. Because when I was younger, it was like literally not that much. It was just kind of like, oh, well, you have your cartoons. You might have like a teen network show you can watch, and that was about it. And so now there's so much variety, like, and you don't have to like it all. Like, I know a lot of people who did not like Luke Cage, and even though I loved it, like, do you not like it, Dr. Young?
Oh no, I'm just always really shocked that people just didn't like Luke Cage. Like, it just always
like, I didn't get it.
Which is stop. Just keep hope alive. Just keep hope alive.
Yes. I thought it was great. I thought Luke Cage was great. But yes, I knew a lot of people who didn't like it. And I was just like, you know what? That's okay too. That's awesome. You have like, where there's other options. And I think that is both like amazing and yet strikes a little bit of jealousy in me that I think a lot more people get so many options and can watch things at different times. Because before it was like, this is your time. That's it. Now go read a book, and that's it now. Like, you've had your TV time. So that's really, really awesome. I do want to talk about a little bit, we kind of touched on it, like about identity and representation, and a little bit about Afrofuturism. I know that is coming up a lot in conversations about just about, I think, our stories in general. I know that I heard Afrofuturism a lot when Black Panther came out. I hear about a lot of people, reading Octavia Butler books. And so how does that all, of course, I think, impact the way we see ourselves in these stories today?
That's a really large question.
Yes, I realize that now.
Well, I mean, just at its surface, right? Like it's in the term, you know, we all know that joke for Black folks who like sci-fi, where they'll say, you know, there are black folks in the future. You know, in the future, in whatever media that's set in the future, guess what? Black folks have not disappeared.
Right.
Although there's a very, this is sort of going a little bit backwards, so forgive me for being discursive, but there's a really funny play from the mid-20th century from 1950s called The Day of Absence, about a fictional small town where all the Black people for one day disappear.
Yes,
they're just gone, and then all the white folks don't know what to do. Don't know what to do. I mean, it's pretty funny. But yeah, I mean, one way that I think about Afrofuturism is just thinking about being able to imagine a world, and this was in the exercise that we did at the start, right? Can we imagine a world in which colonialism didn't happen? Can we imagine a world in which that there's race but not white supremacy? You know, like, I mean, those sorts of things I think are really important, I think, because, you know, sometimes I tell my students who are poets, like, don't forget to write the poems that you would if the world were just, because I don't want their imaginations to be dependent on collective trauma, right? I don't want them to think the only way that I can make art, the only way that I could like try to engage with the world is if I'm responding. In other words, my only resistance can be is some kind of, like, you know, polemic against that which is unjust. And I mean, it's, you know, I worry sometimes, right? And that's what I think that's what Afrofuturism, one goal of its goals is to free us from that, right? What do you think, Dr. Young?
Yeah, like you just fired up some synapses here. One of the things when I'm just thinking about that, right? So of course, when we think of Afrofuturism, we think about this idea of that's why Black Panther resonated so much and people like to use it as an Afrofuturist text, is because how do we imagine Blackness that's not been colonized, right? How do we imagine a Black existence that has not had that particular thing and that we're operating in response to? So that's one of the ways that we think about Afrofuturism. The other part of Afrofuturism is the part that's tied to Black people of African descent and of the diaspora, looking to their own mythologies to imagine what their future looks like. So remembering Blackness did not start at the transatlantic slave trade. Like, we have a whole existence before that moment, that unbelievably huge moment, but that there is a before. So a lot of Afrofuturism is exploring the elements of that before to see and use it as guidance and to use it as like mythological text. So you can have books like the Children of Blood and Bone and things of that nature that are pulling from those particular diasporic identities. And then also Afrofuturism is about allowing and understanding that Black resistance or Black response does not always have to come from a space of outside exteriority, that Black folks have an interior. We have an imaginative interior and how we respond, and that is just as much resistance as the Dora Milaje and Wakanda, right? If you look at a picture of a Black person in the 1960s at a diner, right, while white people are yelling and shit at them, and you're like, they're not fighting back. There's a ton of resistance in there. There's an interiority that is creating a resistance, right? So that Afrofuturism allows us to think about the ways that Black resistance looks different and isn't always about a response to a colonial object. That makes some sense.
Yeah, and there's some, you know, we mentioned Octavia Butler, the parable of the sower seeds. These are all like good and often cited starting places for like thinking about what that might be, but also like, the idea of Black folks writing YA. I'm thinking India Korafor, writing Benti, and just being able to tell those science fiction or speculative fiction stories, makes so much like elbow room, right? I mean, I think about how they're just like spreading out the spaces in which that might be filled up with other kinds of creative action and art making. And it's really, I think the sometimes pressure that comes in to say, does my art, or in other words, like, even to take it about to like Black Panther, like, does the film need to have the perfect politics for me to like it? And I think that's what Afrofuturism sometimes is hacking the system a little bit and saying, like, that's still imagining a white supremacist dominated discussion, right, in which we are, shouting in the wilderness. What if we reimagine the whole world of that, in which we are at the center, right, and then the questions are reframed? And I think that's, in other words, I always think of like the political action of Afrofuturism is the protest that it does for our imagination, right? That it shouts inwardly in that interiority that Dr. Young was talking about, and starts to reimagine what it is at the center of what you're doing and what you're thinking can be done.
Right.
So I know one of the big things that we all kind of discussed, and Rajani was included in this conversation, was about like how we find ourselves in these stories, because we don't all have, there's not a bunch of, storms, unfortunately. There's not a lot of, T'Challa's. Like, when we find ourselves in not just comic book stores, but just like, comic book shows, whatever the case is, how do we find ourselves in representation in these stories? And we were talking about how certain characters, even if they're not necessarily human characters, we they have traits that we consider to be like Black traits, or they're a marginalized character. We kind of just accept them, like, oh, like that character's Black, right? Like, oh, well, like, clearly this person is like of color, like they're a Black person. And if, say, the movie gets made and they're like, they announce the film and it's like, it's a white person, and you're like, but they're Black. And so a lot of anger, because it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, I mean, granted, this is not necessarily a comic book, but I remember when the live action, like, Little Mermaid thing was happening, and they put Melissa McCarthy as Ursula. And granted, Ursula is based off of Divine, a Baltimore legend, but a lot of people see Ursula as a Black woman, as like, a drag queen or a Black woman. And people were pissed, like, how dare you put Melissa McCarthy when like Queen Latifah is right there? Like, I don't understand. So like, we do that a lot of the time with a lot of our characters. What are some characters that you normally see that you consider to be Black characters?
There's so many.
Yeah.
Like, I read Blackness, and I also read woman and feminist into a whole lot of people. Like, I'm always trying to find who I am, and I'm always looking and adding to it. So in a silly way, this is gonna sound dumb, and it's not related to like science fiction, but like, I see Ralph from the Muppets, the little dog. That's a Black person. To me, as a Black piano player who plays jazz, I know this in my mind. I don't care how, but that's how it is, right? We like that. We will find or see the markers and identify it and say, yeah, those are our people. This idea, lots of time in the world of cosplay, that's this idea that people say of the race blending, right? That the nerd universe allows for a lot of race blending, a lot of open space for folks. But then you have the controversies, right? So when the Fantastic Four reboot came out and Michael B. Jordan was cast as the Human Torch, Johnny Storm, right? And the amount of aggression that went on because they're like, how dare you do this, right? And the fights that occurred because they couldn't even do a reimagining of a fictitious family that already had many different avenues that created the family in the first place. That makes some sense. You see the same kind of controversy happen when Idris Elba embodied Roland of Gilead in the Gunslinger series, right? So you have these ideas, these moments of race blending that occur where comic book characters and superhero characters they're kind of porous. They're kind of porous. You can dip yourself into them. That's why they appeal to so many folks. And as such, you can have Roland of Gilead. Why not have him be a Black man, right? Because that's what science fiction and fantasy is supposed to do at all times. So, but I also find it really interesting when you have characters that are not raced as Black or anything else, but then when they have to choose a human form, they choose to be Black. Like in DC Comics, Martian Manhunter, Jones, right? He is a Martian. His ass is green. But when he has to be John Jones, he's just like, you know what, son? I'm a Black man. That's how I'm going to be today. And I have an explanation for why that is the case.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I mean,
he has no say. Leyva, I'm a Black man. That's just the choice. I don't know. Dr. Leyva, what are your thoughts, man?
You know, I
just
think
went
that,
all.
yeah. I mean, I think there's some really interesting things to think about in terms of you know, the tradition of casting. You know, like so there's a tradition of non-traditional casting in theater. If Idris Elba plays Hamlet, nobody's gonna balk in 2020, right? But I think some of that has to do with the medium, like, so Shakespeare being sort of kind of generally accepted as high art, right? And so then that conversation about it becomes even more porous, right? But because comic books and I think animation and some of these other things still are seen in some circles as kind of folk art, or kind of like, you know, like more democratic art, or low art, if you want to use that term, then all of these like people picking at their fiefdoms about what has to be, you know, then the sort of like the purists come out and say how something has to be, but they never have, you know, they never seem to have a problem with, you know, there being no Black people in the movie, right? Like, or no, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, but I mean, I think about the way like some characters like Piccolo from Dragon Ball Z are claimed so like in the culture to be Black, you know, and you know, it doesn't, I mean, this is not strictly a human person. Like somebody in the chat was mentioning Starfire. It's the same thing. Like, this person is not human at all. They are by definition an alien. And a part of me says, well, maybe it's that kind of like intimate otherness that Black folks are connecting to. But that also feels troubling to me, you know, because I actually don't think it's that. I don't think it's purely a kind of connection to outsiderness. You know, I think in the case of Piccolo, what a lot of Black nerds are really doing is picking up on a swagger, right? They're picking up on a kind of attitude, you know, that feels similar to Black hip hop artists, that feels similar to the way that Black people sort of move in the culture, which is so strange, right, from this Japanese cartoon show. But like this slide is a good example. Like, but then there are some times when, you know, you get some lining up, this, you know, Piccolo in a snapback that looks exactly like the color scheme from the Fresh Prince, and then you're like, well, what about, you know, the creators are sort of in on the joke then, you know. But yeah, I mean, it's I think that's I think what's interesting about it is the way that Black folks will be so quick to find themselves, right? And sometimes I see that as being very similar to the way that Blackness can be broad and accept You know, like what is there anything more Black than having a white grandfather? You know, like stuff like that. Like, well, how there can be an acceptance of different, like a multitude of shades, a multitude of textures, a multitude of ethnicities. You know, I think that ethos, right, that we sometimes grow up with, is transferred then to looking at that same acceptance in comics and animation.
I really am feeling on that understanding, especially your assessment, especially the conversation about picking up on the swag, right? Picking up on those little things that say, oh, these are my people, even if they're not intentionally doing it. But I feel like artists often are, right? I feel like the writers often are doing a bit of codiness with people's language and their interactions with one another. And if anything, what comic books and science fiction do is they just adhere to, I think it is E. Patrick Johnson has this understanding of like what makes authentic Black identity is the contest statement. That is what makes Blackness. The constant pull between what we believe or what we see as authentic Blackness and how that can be changed. And the fight between who owns the idea of Blackness as a category. So you see that being played out in these race blending moments in science fiction and fantasy and in comics.
So I was just gonna add really quickly to let everyone know, put this in the chat, but we are gonna have a question and answer portion. So please make sure that all your awesome questions, you are writing them down or holding them. And thank you also for a bunch of you for putting in some examples of people or characters that people have had issues with who are being played by Black people. But Michelle put up a very interesting question. I never actually thought about it. She said that she's the only one that thought that Thanos was Black.
You ain't alone.
And the thing is, I never actually thought about it, but like most definitely, yeah, like she clearly is. I never thought about it.
I know he's played by a white boy, Josh Brolin, but my brother and I, when we were talking, he was just like, he just seemed like a brother, don't he? Yeah, and my brother read the comics. He knows he was Black.
Thank you, Dr. Clemens. That's the argument my family had. They were like, no, he's played by a white guy, but I'm like, I don't know. The timbre of his voice, it's just something about Thanos that is giving me Blackness.
I'm like, you just somebody's grandpa, an angry grandpa.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. So one of the other things that I did want to bring up is that, of course, obviously, you know, we talk about being a Blerd or being a Black nerd, but there are other, you know, communities and groups that are huge fans of comics and find themselves kind of like navigating this world as well. And so I was going to bring in Rajani to kind of talk maybe a little bit about how like, other races or like brown people see themselves in these stories, because like, is there space? I mean, I think there's space, but how is that space actually made, I guess? Like, do they feel welcomed in that kind of space? Is Rajani still here? I guess he is.
I'm cracking up about Black Thanos. I don't think that Black Thanos would see, spoiler, but also everyone should have already watched Infinity War. He wouldn't have dusted Black Panther. If he was Black, he wouldn't have done that. But that is an argument for another time. What was I talking about? I'm over here distracted by I'm having so much fun with these slides. Seeing myself. So I am losing my mind. All right, focus. So I am a very dark-skinned lady who is of Indian descent. Both of my parents immigrated, were born and raised in India. And I was the first of my family born in the United States. And so often I get the question of what you mixed with. From what I understand, it is all South Indian, just in case anybody is confused. And so I'm naming that because in this body of mine and in this nerd dumb of mine, if you can see behind me, I got my little Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek and my Storm stuff. I mean, these were my heroes, right, since the beginning. And these are Black women. Like Uhura is a Black woman, Nichelle Nichols, friends with MLK, like in it. And I saw myself in her, and I saw myself in Storm. And I think maybe it's a piece of this, you know, obviously the Black-white binary is something that we're all having to negotiate with and navigate. I know my brother definitely, and I would just be like, okay, I'm listening to some Black music, I'm listening to some white music, like what did that mean, and what does that mean as far as our culture and Indianness, and how is that connected? We were also navigating that, but I think it's very interesting to think about the ways that it can almost create solidarity or community and connection between various peoples of color, right? Like
Yes.
it's complicated, right? Because, especially when, and I'll just say, as India being in Asia, and I feel I also have connections with Asian characters, and a lot of Asian characters are also really racist, right? Black characters, all these characters of color, deeply racist, but you have this, like, the stoic woman who only does ninja stuff, and it's just like, what? Why can't she speak? Right? And it's just these things that characters who are of Black heritage, and a lot of the nerdy stuff I watched just seemed a lot more well-rounded than any fake Indian character, or that guy from I'm just gonna start making references. What's the guy from Street Fighter? Indian guy from
Dawson.
Street Fighter.
Dawson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Was I going to connect with that guy? Probably not. Was I going to connect with Storm? More likely. And so I don't remember if that is the point that I was supposed to be making, but that's where I'm at. It's just sort of like, where do I fit in this conversation? And I feel very part of this conversation. And not to make it like, what about me? But I just think it's an interesting play of Black characters being a representation and almost a touch point for all, like, children of color, right? To a point.
And I think that's probably a very specific to the US. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
No matter how often we want to talk about racism and white supremacy, it always ends up falling between those two, those two moments, Blackness and whiteness. So it would make sense to me, right? That if we're going to talk about race, the way that our ongoing gestalt in the US is to make it into that binary. And then everyone else just has to be like, well, I'm a little darker, so I'm gonna hang out over here. Or I can assimilate that with some folks, so I'm gonna hang out over there.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think about, like, well, there's a character in that I was going to talk a little bit about, called Machiko, from Machiko and Hachan. And that character specifically is, is an Afro-Latina in a Japanese cartoon, right? But if I imagined myself as a child, and me being, with an African-American mother and a Latino father, right? If I was a child looking at this, I'm not sure that I would be thinking in terms of those ethnic and racialized identities. What I would mostly be doing is, I see another brown person. I see another brown person who is the badass hero, right? Who's having an adventure that feels inviting to me, right? So that they are the the person directing the adventure rather than the person helping another protagonist have an adventure, and that sort of thing, right? I mean, so all that, I mean, it's what some of what I'm hearing from what Rajani is saying is, like, sometimes those brown, anything that is anti-white supremacy becomes a doorway for a kind of multitude of intersections in solidarity, right? So, I mean, it sometimes is, I think, a function of the fact that we have been fed so many white stories and so much white media that, those, we have to take those fissures when we see them.
Yeah.
But then also return to the ways in which the details of ethnicity also matter, right? The different kinds of representation of South Asians or Latinx folks, or et cetera, are just as important in that. It's that collective freedom, right? Until everybody's free, ain't none of us free. And that's also true when we have the conversation of who's showing up in our nerdy media.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to also, I know we're going to talk about, like, joy, or comic books and finding joy and resistance, or resistance and joy, rather. But I do want to kind of open it up to, like, questions to see if anyone wanted to, like, say anything. You can put them in the chat. like if you have any questions for us, or if people want to unmute themselves. Is that possible?
I guess I'll jump in.
Cool.
This is going to be a little weird because I guess I've been undercover creeping a little bit. My name is Jordan Clark, and I'm a comic book writer here in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm doing some stuff for DC starting next week.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Yay!
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
and they just fired a bunch of people too. So if you still got a job, like
yes. But I'll put this in the chat here. I'll be doing a story, like a 2-part story in Aquaman about Aqualad, who is like a black gay teenage superhero who he's on Young Justice. And
Calder.
yeah. So he's Jackson Hyde in the comic books, Calder in the TV show. But yeah, it's definitely, comics I think is a place where it can be difficult to see yourself and find yourself. And I think for me, working in the industry, something I'm definitely trying to keep in mind and work towards is making sure that not only is there representation, but just pushing for that diversity of representation, so that I have a theory called the one and done theory, which is like typically in the 90s, for a lot of TV shows, we would get one show, we would get one thing, and then when you think about something like After Earth with Will Smith, it was like, oh, I guess black people don't like science fiction because they didn't go see After Earth, and it's like, well, we don't like bad movies, so that's the thing. You know what I mean? Like, if it was a good movie, we would have gone and seen it, but
right, it was pretty crappy.
I think so often we kind of get put into these positions where, as Black creators, we are kind of speaking for all of us and having to create for all of us and make things that which is impossible because there's so many of us and so many different experiences. So I'm very happy to kind of get a chance to kind of crack into this space, but also, have a lot of great people who are also in that space and get to work along, a lot of other talented Black creators. So I just wanted to say hi and say that I really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, definitely, look out, not for me specifically, but just for, a lot of other people. If you don't know, like Vida Ayala, they're doing a lot of stuff at Marvel and did some stuff at Valiant. If you're not reading stuff like Bitterroot at Image Comics by David F. Walker and Chuck Brown. Stuff like Tartarus at Image Comics by Johnny Christmas, which is like a great Black science fiction story. And stuff like Upgrade Soul by Ezra Clayton Daniels, which came out, I think, last year, 2 years ago. So there's a lot of great Black creators making comics for us. But it might be a little tricky to find sometimes. But definitely keep an eye out, because we're out here trying to create and represent, and definitely always appreciate the support.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
No problem.
Thank you.
So one of the other questions that I had in here is, someone said, let me make sure I have their name. Katie said that while listening, I've been wondering about how some of these topics overlap with or are different from what we see in the cast of Hamilton, being nearly all people of color. And what are the panelists' thoughts on how Hamilton fits into this conversation? Is this more similar to Stephen saying comments on Idris Elba playing Hamlet?
Y'all trying to get us in trouble. I should probably start by saying, to answer that question, it's a little bit difficult in that it's when we're talking strictly about theater, right? We have some different concerns, right? Because you're intersecting with not like drawn characters abstracted from reality, et cetera, et cetera. You're talking about real humans, like in something which would be true in live action film as well. But I'm a pretty big Hamilton fan. I think it's a pretty well-made piece of art, but I don't think it's perfect, right? And I don't think it needs. I also don't think it needs to be. I think it can be, like all art, a point of conversation, or a point of diversion. But in terms of like, I think it only is a it would only be a point of consternation for me if I imagined Hamilton to be somehow tied to verisimilitude or tied to some kind of mimetic representation of history. When I just say it's historical fiction, it's reimagined. Sure. It doesn't have, I mean, it's like, so what? It's closer to allegory. It's our American myth about the founding fathers, and therefore it does not need to represent them in any particular way. You know, but I mean, in other words, they don't have to be white. There's no violation of verisimilitude, is what I'm saying there, because that assumes that realism is king, right? And that's something that is probably patriarchal, you know, for sure. And so if you reframe it and don't approach that question with realism as the center, as the objective thing to which things are judged, then there is greater space to say why it makes sense if Lin-Manuel Miranda is imagining the founding fathers behaving like hip hop artists, right? That their narrative, that the ethos are the same, not the physical like context, but their ethos are the same. Then it would make sense then that Black and brown folks for whom that art form was made by would embody them. So that's kind of how, that's my take on it. But again, there are many things that are not great about it as well.
I want to 100% co-sign on that understanding. And I think one of the things also that's important is to, when I think of Hamilton, I think of the 52s. I think about the fact that there are 52 different Earths with 52 different Supermen. Like, I'm like, yeah, it's just an expanded universe, right? It's just the opportunity for an expanded universe. And it also is the fact that we get tripped up around this conversation goes back to this idea of always, and I feel like it's a white supremacist thing to put the conversation of authenticity and reality as the ultimate thing that we should strive for in our text. That authenticity and reality. It's like the same way the critique, you know, I teach African American cinema, and one of the things that I teach when I'm speaking to my students is about this. Everybody keeps saying, if you're Black, you're supposed to be talking about the real, witty reality of the, no, you don't. No, you don't. If Lin-Manuel wants to see Alexander Hamilton like beefing, like a rat beef, he is allowed to do such things. Right? The fight how this country is founded as a rat beef, go ahead, have your rat beef, right? It's art, and we get to have expanded universes. We get to have 52 Earths, right? We get to go in Flashpoint and run back and forth every which way and mess up and retcon the whole world all the time.
Yeah, I was also going to say that a lot of the songs in Hamilton, I think when you actually listen to the lyrics, they are like stories of people who are immigrants or people who are marginalized. So like the song of like "Wait for It," like fits perfectly with the story of like a Black person. At least for me, when I saw it, it resonated for me in that way. So I think that like that's the other part about it. It's like they're kind of reimagining it. Someone kind of put like cosplay as a way for Black people to reimagine themselves. But I think there's a very similar kind of thing happening in Hamilton, where it's like you're reimagining like Black and brown people saying and singing these things or having these battles and telling this story and how we actually fit in this larger story of America.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that really quickly, like a food for thought, right? Nobody or very few people question Shakespeare taking Italian stories and making them British, right? Taking these Romeo and Juliet, you know, as a kind of like folk story and repurposing it, right, and reimagining it as, you know, that it's still set in, you know, Verona or wherever it is, but the values of those characters are very, you know, Elizabethan values, and so I don't see much difference between what Shakespeare does with the borrowed stories he uses and adapts into his plays than to what Lin-Manuel Miranda does in adapting an autobiography of Alexander Hamilton, and then using sort of the magic of theater to present it in a way that's entertaining.
As always, it always goes back to the biggest fear that I think a lot of people have is about, since we use so many cultural texts as our actual understanding of history, if folks read things without context, then they don't quite understand. And I, as a teacher, my emphasis is always when you expose people to a text, provide the context with which it was made and how it was made, provide the reality, tell what was happening on the real, and then watch this fantastical take on it.
All right. So some other questions that were here was about like how much does it cost to actually open a comic book store? I am not sure about that. I'm not sure if anybody else is. I do not know.
Who else we got sneaking in this panel? Who? Any comic book owners? Comic book shop owners?
Yeah, any comic book store owners? I am sorry, I cannot answer that question.
I can't answer it either, other than to say that you just remember that there are almost no comic book stores that are owned by comic book stores. They have to, they can't exist that way.
All right.
They have, that's a good video that you all, as a resource, you should check out. But yeah, just to say, like, comic book stores have to sell video games and T-shirts and toys and Magic the Gathering in order. I mean, that's what the retail market is right now. Yeah, so I think the question you might want to ask is not how much does it cost to open a comic book store, but what does it cost to open any kind of specialized retail store? Because they compete in the same space that GameStop competes in. Okay, like they sell very, very similar stuff, except for GameStop doesn't usually sell comic books, and they all compete against Walmart. You know, so it's more a question about retail and retail space, and like who can like the actual space in which we live support it. Like Maryland supports a lot of comic book stores. Ohio, they're seriously, like, if you draw a circle around Columbus, Ohio, there's like not another store in like 50 miles. Like it's really not the same as you move inland into the United States.
Yeah. When I think about that question too, I think about maybe if the conversation isn't about actually owning a comic book store, but having access to texts that might be reflective of the communities that you belong to. I always, once we're able to be in public spaces again with one another, I always advocate that folks go to conventions and go to artist alleys in the conventions and find the artists who are telling the stories that you want, because they're there. Like, they're independents, they're in their own, they're in small presses, but they are there. But you have to go and support those particular artists who are doing it, and go to the cons and visit them and buy their stuff on Etsy, and just keep on supporting the folks who are representing the communities to which you have allegiance and belonging.
So we're actually coming up on our closing time. So I see a couple of more questions here, just about like teaching comic books in schools, and also what is it? Oh, they're talking about Captain America, like being propaganda, which, yes, a lot of stuff with that. We can be here all day and all evening for that. But I also just kind of wanted to wrap up with our kind of comic books as resistant. And so if I could get the panelists to say a couple words just about that, and we can like wrap up the panel. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everybody's questions, but hopefully maybe we can do a part 2. There's a lot of comic books out there. There's a lot of stories that are being told. So hopefully we can like have a next, another one of these. But just like, yeah, some comic book as resistance, joy as resistance, you know, quotes or thoughts before we wrap up. Who wants to go first?
Professor?
I think you know, what I always return to is that Toni Morrison said that the job of racism is to keep you constantly explaining your right to exist. So one way I think about enjoying and participating in, you know, blurred culture, enjoying comic books, animation, film, science fiction, is that it reminds me that I don't always need to engage in spaces in which I need to be a polemic, or I need to be something that represents any kind of tokenism or any kind of, you know, explainer in chief of what Blackness is. I am allowed to just enjoy joy, right? Just to be and experience that which is invigorating, right? And that too, in a world that is anti-Black, Black joy is resistance, you know?
That's it.
Oh.
Anybody want to add anything there, or
can I add something?
It?
I'm gonna add something.
You can, please.
I'm gonna add something, because I'm down with what you just exactly. The one thing I can say though, that the way I see it as a comic book and sort of this moment as resistance, is that when we allow our imagination to work, when we allow ourselves to sit in an imaginative place, going back to our meditation at the beginning of this with Avis, right? Calling back her energy. If we allow ourselves to be in a space of high imagination, then we can envision worlds that don't look upside down. We can envision worlds where we are allowed to stand upright in a room that isn't even crooked anymore. And I think that's extremely important. The one thing I've always loved about science fiction and fantasy is that sometimes these folks can see around corners. They can see where the issue is coming. I think about Parable of the Sower. You can see where the issues are coming. You can also see where the solutions are too. And that is the space of high imagination where we can learn how to do better and create the world that works better. Peace, Avis.
Thank you. So I want to thank everybody for coming and listening to us talk about comics and resistance and the Black imagination. I was really, really excited for this, so I'm really happy to have had, you know, Rajani here, Dr. Young, Professor Lee. I keep mispronouncing your last name, and I don't know why. I wrote it down, Leyva. Did I say it right? Yes, I got it correct. So yes, Professor Leyva, thank you all so much. If you want to learn more about BRJA events, please check out our website at bemoreantiracist.org. Was it .com? Oh, there it goes. Perfect. If you would like to donate to see more events just like this, or, you know, future events, you can click on our donation page. You can find us on Facebook, and as Michelle said lovingly in the beginning, we also have a new YouTube channel, so please check it out there, so we can talk more about these types of topics and so much more. I hope you guys have a beautiful Thursday and go on to Friday. Oh, Rajani, part two. Hopefully we will have a part 2. We will talk more about that.
It was part 2. It has to be called Expanding the Mind, Electric Boogaloo.